Ladies and gentlemen, we are back. We are back for part two of Dr. John Campbell versus the Trigonoms, the Trigonormies, the Trigonom boys, the UK's most hard-hitting truth factory, trigonometry, right? So for those of you that missed part one, Dr. John Campbell, guy who made millions of pounds pushing the vaccines on people and then turned around 3 years later and was like, hey, you know what, I'm on your side now, and maybe these vaccines are poisonous. And he's just got done, the guy who's on our side, the honest doctor, he's just got done telling us how the BBC are bad because they said that vaccines cause autism, and they definitely don't, right? So that's his truth-telling credentials. Okay, he's on there basically saying, well, we all know the BBC are bad because, and wait for the example, we all know the BBC are bad because they said that vaccines cause autism, and they absolutely, definitely don't. I mean, sure, there's a couple of kids that took a vaccine and got autistic like one day later, but they definitely don't. You know, that was his bombshell. So we pick it up from there. And the reason we do these videos, the reason we do these commentaries, these breakdowns, is because the point of the trigonometry bias, right, is that you can put someone like John Campbell on there, okay, and you can pretend like this guy's being grilled by the truther movement, but in actual fact, it's just and softball after softball, and no one actually picks him up on any of the points that he's making. So I just think it's necessary to have somebody just to sort of pick apart what he's saying and say, well, hang on a minute, is this true? And are you really on our side? So, you know, I'm more than happy to do that instead of, you know, just Dr. John Campbell, you're amazing and you're doing fantastically on YouTube. Well done. That's my question.
So the BBC started showing pictures of people, understandably, who were getting sick in Italy, and we never really quite knew what was going on in China. They were giving figures, but we knew that the Chinese figures were inaccurate.
See, you know, when he throws in little words like, you know, understandably, or like the BBC were putting images out of people convulsing in the street and making out like Italy, everyone was going to die. And it's understandably. No, not understandably. Okay? The BBC are the propaganda arm of a giant global government that, in my opinion, is pushing genocide upon the population. So to just turn around and be like, well, you know, understandably. No, not understandably, John. They were trying to terrify everyone into having an experimental medical procedure, and they were doing so deliberately because they're complicit. Okay? It's not just like, oh, they made a little whoopsie-doopsie. They're in on it as well. Okay? This guy is not on our side, in my opinion. He's not giving us an honest appraisal of the situation. What he's doing is whitewashing everything from the supposed position of the good, honest doctor by gum from North England.
So quite what was going on in China, we didn't know. There was leaked videos of people having fits and things in the street, which obviously, looking back, were fraudulent.
Just in case you were wondering, there's no sort of butt in here from the trigonometry bias. Okay, no one sort of says, hang on a minute, wait a minute. Sorry, there was fraudulent videos coming out of China. Hang on a minute, what are you saying? Like, why? Why aren't we making a massive deal about this? So people are making fake videos out of China of people convulsing on the street, and they're being broadcast on like the mainstream media. Like, wait a minute, why? So what you're saying is this is a giant conspiracy, John, but you're just sort of brushing over it as though, well, they showed us some fake videos of people collapsing in the street, and they were obviously fake. But however, moving on, like it's not a big deal. You know what I mean? This isn't a mistake. You don't mistakenly make some fraudulent videos. Okay, the only reason you do that is to terrify people so that they comply when you push an experimental medical procedure on them.
But we had mainstream media picking on the people that were getting sick, and that gave a bit of a distorted picture. And the other problem in the early stages was the differentiation between the case fatality rate and the infection fatality rate. So the case fatality rate, we did work it out, and it was around about 1 or 2% of people that were being officially diagnosed were dying. But of course, for every one person that was officially diagnosed, there was hundreds or probably thousands that got the infection that were never diagnosed. I suspect, for example, I don't know, but I suspect I had it in early 2020. And I've talked to hundreds of people who think that, even people who think they had it in 2019. But of course, it was never officially diagnosed. And as well as that, in the UK, what we didn't do in the early stages that we could have done. Okay, the antigen studies, the antigen tests weren't readily available. There was government PCR testing, but the lateral flow tests weren't there for mass testing. But what we should have done at an earlier stage is do antibody testing to see who had had the infection in the past. And that was another bit of a gap, really, in the government strategy.
Do you see how this is a whitewash? It's like, oh, there was a wee gap in the government strategy. Oh, they were trying to do the right thing, but they just had a couple of gaps in their strategy. And oh yes, I'm sure what happened was they accidentally made out that it was really deadly when it wasn't, because not everyone was diagnosed with it. It's a giant whitewash, this interview. And it's completely one-sided. It's just Dr. John Campbell shilling for the government non-stop, with two people watching him do so like this.
So we were given this information, WHO, government, mainstream media. We had to try and put this together as best as we could with these potential alarm bells from previous infections and previous pandemics. And it did look like we had a pretty serious pandemic on our hands. And in many ways it was serious, but nothing like as serious or deadly as the early intimations indicated.
All right, so I guess because it looked so serious and we had every reason to believe it was serious, I guess the people that were sort of coercing people into getting a gene therapy injection, I guess they were just totally fine to have done that, eh, John? I guess all the evidence that good old lovely Dr. John is looking at suggests, well, if you think about it rationally, then everyone that pushed the vaccines on people was completely correct to do so. I'm just looking at this objectively, man. I made £1 million doing that, and I'm completely unbiased, but the way I look at it, all looks good to me. Nothing untoward going on. It's all just totally normal.
And then as time went on, it became clear that it was becoming the infection fatality rate and the number of people getting seriously ill weren't as many as we thought it was. And then, of course, this wonderful natural evolutionary process comes in, because viruses want to survive. So it's kind of natural that viruses would become less virulent and less likely to kill their hosts as time goes on. And that happened. So we had the original Wuhan variant in this country. Then we had the Alpha variant that you might remember. Then we had the Delta variant. And then something really quite almost supernatural happened. We had Omicron. Omicron came along. Way more infectious, way less pathogenic.
This is the good doctor that's on our side, that's on the side of truth, that's following the evidence wherever it leads. Is there a single establishment narrative that this guy doesn't subscribe to? Oh, there was just this variant, then there was another variant, there was another variant, and we were constantly psychologically tortured in our houses. They were constantly telling us that we were about to die. They were putting on the news the death toll numbers. They were making them up. They were saying people died with COVID, and they were pushing your old people into old people's homes and giving them sedatives until they were dead. But it was all just fine. It was all just normal. It was all these variants coming, and that's why this all happened. There's nothing untoward going on. When you look at Dr. John Campbell's view of things, just whatever the government did or the media did, or indeed he himself did, it was all just totally justified because there was variance, just like it told you on the news.
Way less people getting sick with Omicron. Now, the fact that it's more infectious, you could argue very strongly that that's a really good thing, because it's infecting lots of people really quickly, and that's generating a natural immune response in those people. And as well as that, if you give vaccine, that's just generating immunity in the body. It's what we call systemic immunity. But if you breathe the virus in, then you get immunity in your nose and your mouth and your pharynx.
Is this what you said at the time, John? Was this what you said at the time, buddy? Did you say don't get vaccinated because you won't get natural immunity in your nose and your mouth? Just go and get the virus. Is that what you said? No, it's not, is it? You said go get vaccinated. And it's only now that you're saying, hey, by the way, you got your nose and your mouth, and that's much better than getting the vaccine. Now you're saying that. But is that what you said at the time?
Trachea, what we call mucosal compartment immunity. And that can stop the virus getting into the systemic parts of the body. That's why in the Omicron days, it became much more like common cold type features. So we had all of these changes making the condition less severe. And that meant the risk-benefit analysis for interventions changed dramatically because the risks went down. But the problem, I think, was that government thinking didn't change quickly. I'm not sure mainstream media thinking has changed that quickly yet.
I don't even know if these guys listen to what's being said. They sort of make this face, and then if the attention is drawn towards them, if the guest sort of makes a half sort of joke or says something like, you know, I don't even know if the media, they just sort of did something, they just sort of go, you know? I think their earpieces just tell them what to say, how the establishment wants to move the conversation along. I think apart from that, they just do that unless the guest laughs and then they go, ha ha ha.
I'm not sure mainstream media thinking has changed that quickly yet. And so we have a less serious condition. I'm not saying it's negligible. It's not by any means. It's exacerbating people with previous conditions at the moment. But the risk-benefit analysis of everything has changed really quite dramatically over the last few years.
Well, I guess the government and the media and everything are just completely off the hook then, aren't they, John? You know, it's just completely understandable. Things changed. There's gaps in the government strategy. They sort of got things wrong, and it's all kind of all good. Let's just go on with our lives, and we'll follow the evidence wherever it leads. And the evidence used to lead me to coercing you into getting an experimental medical procedure, but now that I look back on it and I look at the evidence, it's now leading me to say, hey, you know what? I was totally justified to coerce you into getting that medical procedure, but now that people have started figuring out that they shouldn't have had it, now the evidence is leading me to say, oh yeah, absolutely, we shouldn't have done that. But the evidence is also telling me that it's completely understandable that you were coerced by people like me. Man, the evidence is leading me into a lot of convenient places for both me and the establishment. And let me tell you, I'm getting an absolute grilling from the trigonometry boys about it.
We really have to wonder the extent to which government policies have kept up with this. I mean,
John, before Francis jumps in.
Dude, how did you know Francis was about to jump in? What is being fed into their earpieces? Like, how did you know Francis was about to say something? He didn't move or say 1 second or even say anything. His mouth just went like that, and then Constantine was like, before Francis jumps in, did his earpiece say, Francis, jump in?
With this. I mean,
John, before Francis jumps in.
There's something fishy about this whole operation. He didn't even look at him. He was just sitting there like that. Francis made no noise. Constantine is locked in here, and he goes, John, before Francis jumps in. He's not looking at Francis. Francis didn't even make any sort of move that he was about to. There's definitely, he heard in his earpiece that Francis was about to jump in. I'm sure of it.
John, before Francis jumps in.
How did you know he was about to jump in? He's literally facing here. Francis is here. He can't see him. And just as Francis is about to talk, he says, John, before Francis jumps in. The only way he could know that is if there's somebody in the earpiece saying, Francis, say this.
Jumps in. Can I just ask you one question? Because I was curious how your thoughts changed.
Yeah.
Did you support the first lockdown, for example? Was
yes, absolutely. Yes. That appeared to be what was necessary at the time, given the information that we had. Looking back, was I over-reliant and over-trusting on governments and the World Health Organization at the time? Looking back, clearly I was.
Over-reliant on the World Health Organization and the government. Right. Oh, so it's not you, John. It's the government and the World Health Organization that you were naturally relying on. Sure, I was pushing an experimental gene therapy injection on people and advocating for people to be locked in their houses and causing people to commit suicide and businesses to collapse and families to be ruined and etc. But, you know, I was just relying on the government and the WHO like any good doctor would, you know?
But at the time, given the information that we had, it looked like there would be queues of people with severe illness outside of hospitals waiting to get in who couldn't because their hospitals were full. That looked like a possibility at the time.
That is completely untrue. It didn't look like a possibility at the time. It was just the narrative being created by the establishment and fed through the media. That's why people were thinking like that, because the government had their people like Neil Ferguson go on there and make up all these worst case scenarios like he does every time. They deliberately terrified people okay, so that they could implement a lockdown. And John Campbell was one of the people doing it by his own admission. He was like, oh, yes, I was totally doing exactly what the establishment wanted me to, but, I was just relying on them too much, and there was gaps in their strategy, and there's no nefarious agenda, according to John Campbell. There's just little whoopsies being done by the government and him, but it's all just totally normal.
And to be fair, during the early waves, during the Wuhan wave and during the Alpha wave, there were a lot of people getting really quite sick. And if we hadn't had those lockdown measures, a lot more people would have got sick all at the same time.
This is the anti-lockdown truther opposed to the vaccine guy that's on our side, who's like, oh, yes, I was totally for the lockdowns at the time, but knowing what I know now, of course, now I think that, that was totally a great idea still. Huh?
This flatten the curve, flatten the sombrero idea. There is some, I believe there is some reality to that. So many people would have got sick all at the same time. The health service would have been essentially overwhelmed by that. And that means that people that could have been saved with relatively simple interventions, such as giving oxygen or giving antibiotics or giving these steroid drugs, these dexamethasone type drugs, some of those could well have died. That is still possible. So in the early stages, lockdowns were draconian, but there was a good rationale for them.
This is the voice of the truth movement, the anti-establishment doctor. This is the guy. Like, if you're really a doctor or a medical professional that's against the establishment COVID narrative, you know where you end up? You end up banned from YouTube. Okay, you end up making no income for 2 years. You end up kicked out of the whole medical industry. You don't end up with 1 million subscribers on trigonometry, getting shot softballs by people pretending to ask questions that they're getting fed to them through an earpiece. Okay?
In the later stages, of course, when you're talking about restrictions in the time of Omicron, it became patently absurd. But specifically in those early stages, yeah, I could see where they were coming from.
And John, do you still support the first lockdown, or do you think it was an overreaction with the benefit of hindsight?
I think with the benefit of hindsight, knowing everything that we do now, it was necessary to reduce the rate at which people were getting sick. Now, whether that's a lockdown measure, yes, that did do it. Our intensive care units were not overwhelmed. They were remarkably busy for quite some time, but they weren't overwhelmed. Or whether you could have taken the alternative strategy, the sort of Great Barrington Declaration type strategy, where you just took strenuous measures to protect those that were most at risk. So those with comorbidities, those with obesity, hypertension, diabetes, immunosuppression, the elderly. Could we have protected those effectively? It would have been difficult, but it probably could have been done.
So, yes, you completely support all the lockdowns. And so far, over 20 minutes of this interview, you completely support every single government narrative. And any one that the government got wrong and obviously killed people or hurt them, it was a gap in strategy.
But given the uncertainties at the time, the very first lockdown, it's still possible to make a case for it. Later on, certainly not. But in the early stages, it's still possible that it saved lives.
Hey Francis, do you like locals?
I live in London, mate, so obviously not. The only pleasure I get from the locals is when we share an intimate moment as we watch a Japanese tourist get trapped in a tube door.
That is good. But I wasn't talking about the locals. I was talking about our community on locals.
Oh, yeah, definitely give these guys money. Please, guys, send your money to trigonometry, okay? If you don't send them money, how are they going to be able to afford people to feed them questions into their earpiece so they can softball obvious establishment figures pretending to be on our side? Dude, this, like the Trojan horse, this is like, trigonometry doing an interview is like just the grand national of Trojan horses. There's so many Trojan horses on this show, it's ridiculous.
I listened to some of your interviews, and you were saying that you had the vaccine, you had
Yep.
2 vaccines, and then you had the 3rd vaccine, which
Yep.
you hesitated over.
Yep.
So talk to us about your journey with the vaccine, your thinking, and the way it evolved.
I mean, vaccination is such a fundamental part of healthcare.
Do you think this guy is the guy that's on your side? You think this guy is the good doctor helping us out? Vaccination's a fundamental part of healthcare. Is there any proof at all that vaccination actually improves people's health? Because let me tell you what happens in the United Kingdom, okay? From the time a baby is like 6 weeks old, they start plowing it full of 8-in-1 vaccines with polio and hepatitis, and a lot of children that I see going around there just got rashes all over their face, and cancer rates in children are up, etc., etc. My personal opinion is that they're poisoning kids with these vaccines constantly, and it's an absolute disgrace what's being done. But people like Dr. John Campbell just get up there and just coerce you into taking them. But you carry on, dude.
We've eradicated smallpox. You know, I personally conducted vaccination programs in poor parts of the world to prevent polio.
Do you think that Bill Gates is going around like Africa and stuff, giving them polio vaccines because he loves children? Bill Gates, Epstein flight logs, Bill Gates, the guy that believes in population control, and he's going around giving polio vaccines to all these little children in Africa, at the same time flying around with the world's #1 child sex trafficker. You know, you actually believe that they're over there in Africa giving them polio vaccines for their own good? Do you believe that?
You know, vaccination, measles is a terrible disease. Measles still kills thousands and thousands of children a year that aren't vaccinated in poorer countries, particularly, especially if it's combined with malnutrition. So vaccination is an absolutely essential part of healthcare.
I don't believe that it is. I wouldn't believe this. I would recommend that if you have a baby, you don't let them inject it with anything. Just let it be healthy. The last thing you want is, you know, these people from the NHS or whatever who are like, hey, please get your children vaccinated with an experimental gene therapy injection. Do you want to trust them on all the other things that they say you should inject into your children? You know what I mean? This should be a real eye-opener for people, that they will just... These big pharmaceutical companies, do you think they give the vaccines to the NHS free of charge? No, they sell them to them. The NHS are basically a middleman for these big pharmaceutical companies, where they just push all these horrible, unsafe, in my opinion, injections that you have to give to your baby or you're a bad person. And people like John Campbell are just perpetrating this myth that it's all for the good of your children.
So when we had a new viral disease, it made perfect sense that we would develop a vaccine. That made perfect sense. And when the vaccines came along, I believe that these vaccines would protect us against severe disease, which in the early stages, they did. I believe they did protect us against severe disease in the early stages. Now, how much someone like me was at risk from severe disease, of course, is open to some question and debate.
So the vaccines are brilliant. They definitely help loads of people, and it's completely understandable that we're coerced into getting them. This is the doctor that's on the side of the truth movement on trigonometry, and this is the interview that they're giving you. And you're going to send them your money on locals to keep the truth alive.
What I'm really curious about is what we've always done with vaccines in the past is you brew up lots of virus, and you can easily do that. We used to do it in the old days in eggs. Well, my predecessors did it on eggs. Now we have cell cultures, and you can brew up any amount of virus. This is the approach the Chinese took, for example, with their Sinovac vaccine. So you brew up untold billions of viral particles. You kill them and mush them up, and then you inject them. So what you're injecting is an attenuated or a dead viral particle. The immune system then learns to recognize that dead viral particle, that antigen. But that dead viral particle can't cause disease because it's dead, or it's so attenuated it can't reproduce. It's just parts of the virus.
And then what they also load them up with, which John isn't telling you about, is stuff like mercury and all these neurotoxins and cancer-causing chemicals and God knows what else, and then they shoot them into a 6-week-old baby. And there's absolutely no side effects. It's totally safe to get dead virus and mercury and cancer-causing chemicals and pump them into your child along with 8 other versions of the same thing when they're 6 weeks old. It's great. It's an essential part of healthcare.
What I don't understand, and no one's ever explained this to me, is people had invented these adenovirus vector vaccines. And people had invented these messenger ribonucleic acid, these mRNA vaccines. What no one has explained is why we went hook, line and sinker, lock, stock and barrel into these new viral vector and mRNA vaccines.
then why did you take them? And why did you coerce people into taking them? Why did you use your massive platform that you suspiciously gained into telling people to take them? If you were so skeptical, why would you take one and tell other people to take one? That's my question. But the question you're going to get from the trigonometry boys is...
rather than using the more traditional approach to vaccination. Because given that we had what looked like a really potentially quite dangerous pandemic, I would have thought that the safest thing to do is do that which is tried and tested and we know works. And we know these vaccines have some level of efficacy. The Chinese vaccine did. I think they made a few in Cuba as well, in virtually no time at all, just from brewing up huge amounts of the virus. Why was it we went for the mRNA vaccine, which is not giving the antigen, it's not giving the dead virus, it's giving the genetic instruction to make the virus? And the adenovirus vector vaccines are also giving the genetic instruction to make the virus. It's just that it's getting into the cells of the body via, in the case of the Oxford vaccine, an attenuated chimpanzee adenovirus. Whereas the mRNA vaccines were giving the mRNA in these lipid nanoparticles. Why did we do that rather than going down the traditional route?
Oh, yeah, this is definitely something to ask after you've taken them and coerced people to take them. By the way, I seriously doubt this guy's taken them. But this is definitely a question to ask now and not then.
That's the big question that hasn't really been answered.
John, I suppose a pushback would be...
Pushback? Pushback? I'm sorry, I'm a regular viewer of trigonometry. I subscribe on Locals. What is a pushback? I don't think... Have we ever seen that in a trigonometry interview before?
And look, I'm just a comedian on the internet, so you could argue...
You're absolutely entitled to have an opinion about COVID, mate. That's how it works now. We're both experts.
Exactly.
Dead right you are.
Anyway,
yeah.
I got my PhD from the University of Life. Now...
Do you see how duplicitous, do you see how dishonest this program is? You know, before he asks a question, it's framed with this kind of like, oh, I'm just an comedian on the internet, and I'm just an idiot, and anything that I'm not an expert, so obviously disregard this. And then it's kind of, oh, you're allowed to have an opinion, mate. Well, you know, where everyone is now, ha, 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 ha. But it's all framed like, if you're not an expert, you can't really have an opinion. And it's hilarious that he's about to push back because he's not an expert. Or you're allowed an opinion on COVID. You know, it's all pushing the establishment narratives whilst pretending to be against them. It's really...
Sinovac, the example that you just used, is incredibly ineffective when compared to the other vaccines, is it not? And the AstraZeneca, which I think uses a technology you talked about, was then withdrawn because of the effects of myocarditis.
Yeah. Who told you that, Francis? Who told you who told you Sinovac's incredibly ineffective?
I read it in the mainstream media.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to get good data from China. The data we have got from China is largely filtered through the World Health Organization.
You notice how Francis is framed like a complete idiot for daring to ask this guy a question. He's just framed like, who told you that, moron?
And what that seems to show with the Sinovac vaccine is it's not particularly good at preventing infection in the first place. But when you actually compare it to, but you know, who really cares? Who do you want to prevent infection in the first place? You know, if you get a bit of a sniffle, that doesn't matter too much. Plus, if you get the infection, you're going to produce what we said before, this mucosal compartment immunity. So you could argue that is a good thing. But when you actually look at the data, the reason I took these vaccines is I thought there was a chance of me dying if I got this infection. So that would be bad, or getting very ill. That would be a bad thing. So you don't want that. But when you look at the actual data for the Sinovac vaccine and what we would call the sophisticated Western vaccines, in actually preventing death, the difference between the two is not that great. So if you want to stop people getting seriously ill and dying, there's a good argument to be made that the Sinovac probably would have been just about as good as the mRNA vaccines. And of course, remember that the initial trials on the mRNA vaccines were on preventing infection. Now, I used to have a sign behind me that said, stop COVID-19, because we thought we could stop it. We thought we could eradicate this. And pretty well for all of 2020, I thought we could eradicate this virus. But now, no, we can't stop it. You can't stop it. We are going to be endemic. We are, you and me, us three, are going to, and everyone watching is going to be re-exposed to this virus innumerable times over the next, who knows, decade, 2 decades. You know, probably for the rest of you guys' lives, you're going to be continuously re-exposed.
Sorry, when are you going to talk about myocarditis in the AstraZeneca? When are you going to get to that part of the question?
So we can't get rid of it. We have to learn to live with it. So preventing infection really is a bit of a red herring. It's not what we wanted to do. We wanted to stop getting people really sick. Now, if you look at the British Heart Foundation guidelines, they actually say that the reason that we've stopped using the AstraZeneca adenovirus vector vaccine in the UK is because we have better ones, mRNA vaccines. To tell you the truth, I'm not that convinced. I'm not that convinced by that argument. Because as you correctly say, Francis, the AstraZeneca vaccine can cause myocarditis and pericarditis, but actually not that much.
Aha! There we go. I thought Dr. John Campbell was going to, and trigonometry, were going to say something honest there. I thought, wow, they've brought up myocarditis. Wow, what an honest move. Here we go. This is why they've brought it up, to be like, hey, yeah, some people are dead from myocarditis, but hey, not that many. I'm totally on your side. I'm not shilling for Big Pharma, but it's not that bad.
Mostly what it caused was blood clotting. So we had this, what we call thromboembolic problems. We had blood clots in the blood vessels, and it was the thromboembolic complications of the AstraZeneca vaccine that were particularly problematic. So I'm just wondering if the reason that the British government stopped using the AstraZeneca vaccine was because they thought it was causing too many side effects. If that's why they stopped using it, because they thought it was causing too many adverse reactions, I'd quite like to hear them say that.
I'd like to hear them say that. What now? Now, years after everyone's taken it, after they were coerced into taking it, now you want the government to say, oh, actually, you can die from this. Why weren't they saying it before? Why weren't people like John Campbell saying, oh, hang on, you can get myocarditis from this vaccine? And that can kill you, and it's a lifelong heart condition that can kill you. Or it can clot up your veins and cause your heart to have a problem, and you can have a heart attack if you're a 40-year-old man, and lots of them are, Like now we're starting to see them bring up myocarditis, and oh yeah, it does give you blood clots and myocarditis, but only a little bit, and this and that. We're slowly being sort of fed the actual narrative that these things are really, really, really dangerous. But just one little bit at a time. But I do find it interesting that we're now seeing people like trigonometry and Dr. John Campbell bring up myocarditis, and they're sort of starting to say, oh yeah, you can get it, and it does kill you, and you can get blood clots, but not that many. And, we're just sort of gradually the narrative is changing into, oh yeah, these vaccines can be deadly, but it's only a couple of them. But maybe at some point we'd like the government to say, oh, by the way, lots of people are now going to get dead from the vaccines, but hey, at least we're telling you now. Listen, we're going to have to do a part 3 of this because there's far too much. This is a half an hour long video. We'll have to split it into part 3. Do make sure that you support this channel on Locals or Subscribestar or something like that, because I don't have an earpiece, and it's really expensive for me to get an earpiece and have like Bill Gates live telling me what to say. Okay, see you in the next video.